Welcome to another video. This time I want to throw out my most honest job recommendations that I ever did, because I feel like it could be the first moment where differences are actually seen, and instead of comfort for beginners, discomfort and accessibility is really a big deal for starting into any form of difficult content. So let me hop into the subject. Even though each and every form of content can and will be cleared by each and every job, sometimes learning new mechanics will hinder your optimal performance significantly, which is the whole reason for this video. So yesterday, since a long break from Savage or any content above the usual Duty Finder or Bozja shenanigans, I formed up a very generous party to start into practicing or progging into the first fight of the recent Savage Eden tier, Eden 9 Savage, featuring the Cloud of Darkness. And as basically 6 of our group knew the fight already and how to play the game with the job they have taken, our success completely depended on me and another player that never did any Savage content yet, but really gave all of his heart to improve and learn the mechanics. So in this regard, I would say we were kinda even, although that I was a bit distracted from the fact of being live on Twitch. Nonetheless, and why I absolutely feel to make a video about this topic, is the DPS output between both of us. While I might have more experience on performing that which I call the summoner rotation, there were some serious aspects taken out of the DPS differences between the other new player and myself, especially due to the fact that he has taken the route of playing a samurai and I chose the summoner for this situation. Alright, first of all, you have to know that Eden 9 Savage, for example, really depends on precise movement, especially on the tile phase, where each player has a very strict movement and positioning pattern for the tiles you have to share for not dying, which is the first big argument against melee jobs in Savage proc. So whenever there is precise positioning and movement, you as a newcomer to the fight will struggle immensely in making a brave move to focus on your correct positional for pushing out good DPS. That of course, even under the almighty boost of the Echo, is required for extreme, Savage and ultimate content, and I just realized, especially when trying fights like this or Eden 2 Savage for example, where players are forced to strict movement patterns as well, at any point of lacking the confidence about the mechanics happening, you always act restrained, eminently when your own failure could mean the demise of other players too, or wipe the whole party. This is where ranged DPS jobs and casters like the Summoner come into play. Yes, I will lose 40 potency each time I choose to cast Rune 2 instead of Rune 3 when panicking and not exactly knowing where to stand or where to catch a certain mechanic, but that is much better than not hitting the boss with any of your skills at all. Which leads us to the topic of uptime. While any melee job is required to be at the boss, at least meaning to ultimately get a position close to the boss's hitbox, all ranges don't have this limitation. So you're not only flexible when it comes to your position, but also basically have the boss in range every second it is there at all. So while I don't think melees are bad in any regard, they're definitely pushing in another form of requirement and difficulty level above learning mechanics, because you have to learn them, stick to them while getting a spot at the boss. The kinda same applies to tanks as well, but more to that later. Of course, this doesn't apply to all bosses, but as far as I experienced this, positionals and movement are one of the main focuses when Team Yoshida designs Savage bosses, and especially ultimate bosses. And yes, once you understand these mechanics, there are definitely some advantages melee jobs are offering, like bigger hit pools, no cast interruptions or good utility support, but this uptime topic really is a stepping stone you should be aware of. And especially on our try for Eden 9 Savage, I figured out that this stepping stone held back our samurai player significantly, while I could at least perform my rotation without any struggle when I was alive. And while this may place melee jobs at the low end for progging into difficult content, where positioning and movement matters much, not all ranged physicals and casters are on the same difficulty level here as well. As a matter of fact, the Black Mage kinda suffers from the same aspects as melee jobs do, due to its inability to move freely and having a lot of hard cast spells that its rotation is demanding, especially when it comes to placement of ley lines and stuff like that. It could even get worse than on very smooth Dragoon or Samurai player, for example, that at least don't have to interrupt their casting sequences. So when you're new to certain fights, playing a Black Mage could possibly keep your performance down on the same level like you could struggle with a melee job. Which brings us to the, you might call it an A tier of jobs that progging with is basically a blessing. Namely, all ranged physical DPS jobs. And when it comes to accessibility and overall difficulty level of playing them, all of them are basically the same. While they may not push out the highest damage among all on paper, bringing with group support, at least on Dancer and Bard, their damage is consistent, and there's not one single aspect that will delay or hinder your uptime because of having no hard casts that can be interrupted by movement or the requirement of a certain proximity to the boss, other than just not standing 50 feet away. That happens rarely.
So much. What is uptime? Uptime? I always have the boss in my range. The only time when I don't have uptime is when I'm standing here and the boss is there. That's when I lose uptime, which is not very often.
So when you're looking for a carefree progging and learning experience, the straightforward baseline rotation of any of these ranged physical jobs will at least offer the contribution of yourself that the party may demand to get over enraged timers, which should not be a thing when using the echo buff and getting some equipment in advance, but when you have some black mages or melees with you that lack the confidence to get uptime or to know mechanics so well that they preemptively find the proper spot to use their ley lines and perform flawless cast sequences, I guess you may still need any pinch of damage you can get. And even from there, I honestly think that ranged physical rotations are also more straightforward to optimize, at least when not looking at the last 0.1% of players, when comparing them to the rotation of a ninja for example, just simply due to the fact that positionals are no thing on them. Still, I have another personal but filled up with arguments S tier of jobs, and from the introduction you may have guessed it already, Summoner and Red Mage. Both of these jobs not only negate the downsides of a melee job, but also offer significantly more raw damage power than their ranged physical counterparts, at least when it comes to Bard and Dancer. And yes, while balancing is not a thing on a good flowing group constellation, sometimes these constellations just don't happen, especially in party finder content or when randomly stacking up your group with non-structured order of DPS jobs. Of course, some keen players that play a good bunch of jobs already may intervene now by telling that Summoner and Red Mage still have to hardcast stuff, making them at least worse than ranged physicals, and basically you're right. But due to the Red Mage's dual cast ability and cast being very short and completely independent to a certain rotation other than just alternating between black and white mana spells, this aspect is not worth mentioning, as every second cast you're able to move freely and also have access to swift cast that can help you out in longer movement situations than usual. But of course, when constant movement is required, the Summoner definitely takes the lead, and losing only 40 potency per situation where movement had you switch from Rune 3 to Rune 2 instead, I actually consider this as a design flaw, because it feels like standing in no relation to the downsides of other roles and jobs, especially when comparing it to a Black Mage. And while Red Mage could also be put into the same niche with ranged physicals, there is still one aspect that both Red Mage and Summoner offer for proc and learning new mechanics, which is a godsend, namely raising capabilities. Yes, these are truly limited when you die by yourself very often, when learning new stuff and not having a good amount of MP to actually raise your allies, but as most bosses demand the survival of all players to fight off certain mechanics that strictly demand each player to be alive, this can make a true difference and help out your healers so much that I cannot count the situations anymore where raising somebody, especially a healer, has saved us from a total wipe or could at least push us into the next phase to learn and test more mechanics. Not mentioning the many situations where you want to show a fight to a friend, and by being able to raise that friend occasionally, the impact of his numerous deaths may have alleviated significantly. And as I told you guys that this may be a very personal and honest video, I would actually also make a difference between the Summoner and Red Mage, just from the fact that the Red Mage has to go into melee combat from time to time and has no real solid option to overcome longer periods of movement, where the Summoner can easily just spam Rune 2 instead of Rune 3, and automatically finds itself in so many free casting stances and has Rune 4 procs and Aggie assaults at its disposal on top of that. And if you think I'm biased, I may be, but these aspects are arguably turning the Summoner into something special, and I'm honestly glad that they have kept its damage in check with the latest patches. Otherwise, its SS tier spot on this video would have been renamed to God tier. Okay, so much so good, but what about healers and tanks? This is really difficult to compare to any DPS job, but I would personally say getting started into difficult content is definitely easier on a healer than on a tanking job. This heavily depends on the fight though we're talking about. There are tons of fights where strain on the tank is insane, and some where healers have to take up the heaviest responsibility. But overall, I would say healers are easier to get used to, as they're offering the absolute easiest offensive rotations, while pushing out healing abilities constantly should mostly be avoided. So you basically have a lot of time on focusing on mechanics, where tanks always have to train their muscle memory, finding the right spot for the boss to be placed, do their own rotations properly and use defensive CDs appropriately. But please take this with a grain of salt and remember that this is heavily depending on the boss you're dealing with. But apart from that, taking up a tank is definitely a more difficult starting point for getting into Savage content, especially when taking up the reins of the main tank. And surely, when it comes to specific jobs inside of these roles, for healers my best recommendation still is the White Mage because of being simple yet effective. And among tanks, I would say you cannot do anything wrong with a Warrior Paladin, but you can also not do anything wrong with Gunbreaker or Dark Knight either. So if you find yourself struggling with a certain job when starting fresh into difficult content, maybe consider progging it with one of the jobs I recommended for the various reasons. Or just bite the bullet and flex with the confidence of still keeping uptime as a ninja, monk, dragoon or samurai to smash down your enemies with brute force, which definitely is among the biggest upsides of pure melee awesomeness. And like always, note that these differences become narrower with each try. So after some tries and when you learned how to deal with each mechanic, all of them work smoothly and provide the fitting contribution to beat any boss this game has to offer. And of course, if you want to know more about these jobs specifically or learn their basic playstyle aspects, check out the many videos on my channel or visit Salted Final Fantasy XIV or Wesk Alba's phenomenal beginner guides. Until next time, stay safe, stay healthy and keep loving Final Fantasy.